cutting right through the low base of the jukebox. A sharp, sudden fracture split the ice in his whiskey glass. It was exactly the sound a man makes when the very ghost he's been drinking to forget takes the bar stool beside him and calmly orders a water with lemon. The Anchor was the kind of dive bar that didn't pretend to be anything else. It smelled of cheap pine cleaner, decades of stale hops, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from a neon sign that buzzed like a dying wasp in the front window. The floor was covered in a sticky black linoleum that grabbed at the soles of your boots, and the air was thick enough to chew, heavy with humidity and the collective exhalations of men trying very hard not to think about tomorrow. Jordan sat at the far end of the scarred mahogany bar, her back to the wall, her eyes casually tracking the front door in the mirrored reflection behind the liquor bottles. It wasn't paranoia, it was hardwiring. You spend enough years treating every threshold as a potential fatal funnel. You don't just turn it off because they hand you a DD, 2, 1, 4, and a pat on the back. Her body was a map of localized, throbbing aches. The L4 vertebra in her lower back was humming with a dull, grinding pain, a souvenir from a hard landing during a fast rope insertion off the coast of Somalia that she usually managed to ignore. Tonight, it demanded attention, sending sharp little electrical shocks down her left leg every time she shifted her weight. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her pulse beneath the skin. She was nursing a glass of tap water, watching the condensation pool into a small, dark puddle on the cardboard coaster. She didn't want to be here. She hated the posturing, the loud, barking laughter of men trying to prove they were still lethal, still relevant. But the quiet of her apartment was worse. In the quiet, the ringing in her ears grew deafening. In the quiet, she could smell cordite and copper. Here, the sheer volume of human messiness drowned out the ghosts. The front door swung open, letting in a gust of damp Virginia Beach air and 3 men. Jordan didn't turn her head, but her eyes flicked to the mirror. They had the look, heavy shoulders, thick necks, and that specific, rolling gait born of carrying too much weight over uneven terrain for too many years. They wore faded denim and tactical brands that screamed their profession to anyone who knew how to read the labels. But it was the guy in the lead who caught her attention. He was older than the other 2, maybe pushing 40. His beard was unkempt, threaded with gray, and his eyes were restless. He had the hypervigilance of a man who hadn't slept deeply in a decade. He laughed at something one of the younger guys said, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, scanning the room, categorizing threats, exits, and obstacles. He broke off from his group, clapping one of them on the shoulder, and waded through the dim light toward the bar. He picked the empty stool, 2 seats down from Jordan. Maker's mark. Neat. "Leave the bottle," he told the bartender, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it had been scraped over sandpaper. Jordan took a slow sip of her water, keeping her gaze fixed on the television mounted in the corner, which was silently broadcasting a baseball game. She could feel his gravity. He was the kind of man used to taking up space, used to people deferring to him. He poured his first drink, knocked it back in one violent, seamless motion, and exhaled sharply. He poured a second, slower this time. Then he turned his head. "You're a quiet one," he said. Jordan didn't look at him. "It's a quiet night." "Not in here, it ain't." He shifted on his stool, angling his body toward her. He was looking for an anchor, someone to talk at, someone to ground him. "Carter," he said, extending a hand. The knuckles were heavily calloused, the fingernails blunt and clean. Jordan stared at the hand for a second, longer than was polite. She hated touching people. It required letting down a microscopic fraction of her guard. But she reached out, her grip firm, brief, and completely devoid of warmth. "Jordan." Carter's eyebrows twitched. He squeezed, just a fraction harder than necessary, a subconscious test of dominance. Jordan's hand didn't yield. She let him hold the pressure for exactly 2 seconds before smoothly rotating her wrist outward, breaking his leverage and sliding her hand free. It was a micro-movement, A civilian wouldn't have noticed it. Carter noticed it. He blinked, looking down at his empty hand, then back up at her face. "You got a strong grip, Jordan," he murmured, picking up his glass. "I carry my own groceries," she replied, her voice flat, devoid of the flirtatious lilt he was clearly expecting. Carter let out a short, barking laugh. "Right. Groceries." He leaned on the bar, looking her up and down. She was wearing a bulky, faded green canvas jacket that hid her frame, and a dark baseball cap pulled low. There was a jagged, pale line of scar tissue barely visible at the base of her throat, peeking out from the collar of her t-shirt. "You waiting for a boyfriend?" Carter asked, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Husband? This isn't exactly a spot for tourists." "Not waiting for anyone," Jordan said. She traced the rim of her glass. "Just killing time." "Well, you're doing it in a room full of wolves, sweetheart," Carter said, leaning closer. He smelled of stale alcohol, wintergreen chewing tobacco, and that underlying, sour scent of adrenaline sweat that never quite washes out of a combat veteran's pores. "Most of the guys in here, we do things the rest of the world doesn't want to think about. We're the bump in the night." It was the classic pitch. The vague, brooding hint at special operations meant to elicit wide-eyed awe from a civilian woman. Jordan felt a wave of profound, bone-deep exhaustion wash over her. She knew exactly who he was. She knew his training, his deployment cycles, the specific brand of arrogant misery he wore like armor. She knew it because she had lived it. "Sounds exhausting," Jordan said dryly, turning her gaze back to the baseball game. "You should try chamomile tea." Carter frowned, clearly thrown off the script. He opened his mouth to reply, his jaw tightening, ready to escalate. Then, 20 feet behind them, a waitress slipped on a puddle of spilled beer. The sound was explosive in the cramped space. A heavy plastic tray hit the linoleum, followed by the catastrophic shattering of half a dozen thick pint glasses. Crash. Carter reacted instantly, his shoulders hunched forward, pulling into a protective shell. His right hand twitched down toward his right hip, a muscle memory searching for a sidearm that wasn't there. His breath hitched, his eyes blown wide, snapping toward the sound with a sudden violent intensity. It was a textbook startle response from a central nervous system permanently stuck in overdrive. Jordan did not flinch. Her shoulders didn't rise. Her hands didn't twitch. Her heart rate, holding steady at 55 beats per minute, didn't spike, but her eyes moved. With chilling mechanical precision, Jordan's gaze snapped from the television to the mirror. In a fraction of a second, her brain processed the visual data. Waitress on the floor. Spilled amber liquid. Broken glass. No weapons. No screaming indicative of trauma. No secondary threats. Threat assessment, 0. She smoothly broke her gaze from the mirror, picked up her glass of water, and took a slow sip. Carter, recovering from his adrenaline spike, forced his shoulders to relax. He cursed softly, dragging a hand down his face, embarrassed by his own hyper-reaction. He turned back to Jordan, expecting to see a civilian startled by the noise. Instead, he saw a statue. He stared at her. He played the last 3 seconds back in his head. He had watched her reflection in the mirror when the glass broke. He saw the way she hadn't jumped. He saw the cold, dead-eyed sweep of the room, the immediate categorization of the event, and the instant, terrifying return to baseline. That wasn't civilian shock. That wasn't even the PTSD-riddled flinch of a regular infantry grunt. That was the absolute icy control of a predator. That was Tier 1 emotional regulation. The flirtatious, arrogant swagger melted entirely off Carter's face. The alcohol seemed to evaporate from his system, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. He looked at her not as a woman at a bar, but as an anomaly, a puzzle piece in the wrong box. He looked at her hands again, really looked. He saw the thick, permanent calluses on the webbing between her thumb and index finger, the exact spot where the backstrap of a heavy pistol rubs raw over 10,000 repetitions. He looked at the way her jacket hung, realizing it wasn't just bulky, it was sized to conceal the unnatural width of her shoulders and back. He looked at her eyes. They weren't just quiet. They were empty, stripped of the naive light that civilians carried. "Who the hell are you?" Carter's voice was completely different now. It was low, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the voice he used on the radio. Jordan didn't look at him. "I told you, Jordan." "Bullshit," Carter whispered, leaning in. He wasn't invading her space for intimidation anymore. He was doing it so the rest of the room couldn't hear. Nobody doesn't flinch at a sound like that unless they're dead or they've been trained to eat gunfire for breakfast. You've got the grip of a door kicker and the eyes of a sniper. "Who are you with?" "I work in logistics," Jordan lied smoothly, her voice a placid lake. Carter let out a short, dark scoff. "Don't insult me. I know every operator in the teams. I know the DevGru guys. I know the Rangers down at Hunter. I know the CIA spook attachments. I don't know you. It's a big military." "Carter, it's a small neighborhood," he shot back, his eyes narrowing, scanning her face for any tell, any micro-expression. "You're not support. You're a shooter." "But that's impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Jordan said softly, "just statistically improbable." Carter stared at the side of her face. The hum of the neon sign seemed to grow louder in the silence between them. He picked up his whiskey glass, the condensation making it slick in his grip. He was putting pieces together, connecting wild, drunken campfire rumors that he had always dismissed as absolute fiction. "There was a rumor," Carter started, his voice barely audible over the jukebox. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring into his glass, as if the amber liquid held the answers. "A couple years ago, whispers coming out of Coronado. Said Brass was running a dark program, trying to see if they could push a female through Bud S. Not the watered-down shit, the real meat grinder." Jordan remained perfectly still. The dull ache in her L4 vertebra suddenly felt very sharp. "Everyone called bullshit," Carter continued, his knuckles whitening around his glass. "Said biology wouldn't allow it. Said the rucks would snap a woman's pelvis, that the cold water would kill her. But then, a year later, a new ghost story started floating around. An attachment to a Tier 1 element in Syria. Someone small, someone who didn't use the comms network. Just a shadow." Jordan gently placed her water glass on the coaster. She aligned it perfectly in the center. "Rumor said this shadow was caught in a massive fuck-up in Raqqa." Carter's voice was shaking slightly now. He was speaking to a ghost. "A Black Hawk went down in a hot zone. Intel was bad. The compound was rigged. QRF was 20 minutes out, and the perimeter was collapsing." Jordan closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. The smell of the bar, the bleach, the beer vanished. It was replaced instantly by the suffocating stench of burning aviation fuel, the metallic taste of her own blood, and the fine, choking dust of pulverized concrete. She could feel the agonizing, sickening grind of her femur bone, fractured in two places, grating against itself as she dragged her body behind a blown-out mud wall. "They said." Carter swallowed hard. "They said." One operator stayed behind, ordered the rest of the element to carry the wounded pilot to the extraction point while they held the choke point. A suicide mission. Legend says this operator held off a dozen combatants with a shattered leg and a dry rifle. Legend says she bought them the 20 minutes they needed. Carter finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto Jordan's profile. There was fear in his eyes now. Real, unadulterated awe and terror. "Legend says she died in the dust," he whispered. Jordan turned her head. She looked Carter dead in the eyes. The camouflage was gone. He was looking at the bottom of the abyss, and the abyss was looking right back. "The rifle wasn't dry," Jordan said, her voice a hollow, raspy whisper that cut through the noise of the bar like a scalpel. "I had 3 rounds left." The air between them vanished. Carter stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face, leaving his rugged features pale and slack. His mind short-circuited, struggling to reconcile the impossible myth with the broken, quiet woman sitting 2 feet away from him. "Jesus Christ," Carter breathed. His hand, holding the heavy glass of Maker's Mark, began to tremble. What's your call sign?" Jordan held his gaze. She didn't blink. She let him see the graveyard in her eyes. Chalk. Carter's fingers went numb. The heavy glass slipped from his grip, plummeting downward. Crack. The ice in his whiskey cracked as the glass hit the brass footrail, shattering into 100 jagged pieces. The amber liquid splashed across the tops of his boots, soaking into the leather. But Carter didn't look down. He just stared at the ghost, realizing he was sitting next to the most dangerous thing in the room. The bartender, a heavy-set man wearing a stained apron, pointed a thick finger at the mess on the floor. "Hey, you drop it. You pay for it, asshole." Carter didn't hear him. He was staring at Jordan's hands, tracing the faint, white webbing of scar tissue that disappeared under the cuffs of her jacket. The jukebox in the corner switched to a slow, grinding blues track, the bass vibrating through the floorboards. But for Carter, the room had gone dead silent. "Chalk," Carter repeated. The word sounded heavy in his mouth. "Toxic." "Get him up," Jordan said, her voice raising just a fraction, projecting past Carter to the bartender. She didn't look at the man. She just slid a crumpled $20 bill from her pocket and pinned it to the damp wood of the bar with her index finger. "Keep the change," the bartender grumbled, snatching the bill and turning away. Carter finally dragged his eyes from her hands to her face. The bravado, the predatory lean, the drunken arrogance, it was all gone. It had been replaced by a sickening, hollowed-out reverence that made Jordan want to vomit. She hated that look. She had seen it on the faces of commanding officers, psych evaluators, and the few teammates who knew the truth. It was the look you gave a martyr who had the audacity to survive. "They said you didn't make it," Carter whispered. He leaned back on his stool, his breathing shallow. "The after-action reports. The rumors. They said you bled out in the courtyard." "They said a lot of things," Jordan replied. She picked up her water glass, but didn't drink. The ice had melted, leaving the liquid tepid. "Reports are written by men sitting in air-conditioned tents 50 miles from the cordite. They look at drone feeds and heat signatures. They don't know what it smells like when a mud brick wall vaporizes." "How?" Carter asked. He leaned in again, but this time he kept his hands flat on his knees, a subconscious display of harmlessness. "How did you get out?" The QRF was delayed. The perimeter was gone. Jordan closed her eyes. The neon sign buzzed. The smell of cheap pine cleaner briefly cut through the memory, but it wasn't enough. Show, don't tell. The golden rule of the debriefings. But how do you show a nightmare? "I didn't stay behind to be a hero, Carter," Jordan said. The words tasted like ash. She opened her eyes and looked at him, letting the ugly, pathetic truth bleed into the air between them. "My femur was splintered into a dozen pieces. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even crawl. If they tried to carry me, they would have slowed down. If they slowed down, the pilot died. If they slowed down, they all died. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was math." Carter swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his collar. "I dragged myself behind a blown-out bakery," Jordan continued, her voice slipping into a flat, detached cadence. The voice she used with the shrinks at Bethesda. "I had a Mark 18 with a jammed bolt and a SIG P 226 with 3 rounds in the magazine. It was 112 degrees. I wedged a piece of rebar against my shattered leg to keep the bone fragments from severing my femoral artery. And I waited." She paused, watching a bead of water slide down the side of her glass. "They came. Of course they came. They smelled blood," she said. "I shot the first 2. The third one dropped a fragmentation grenade over the wall before my slide locked back." Carter's knuckles were white. He was living it with her. his own traumatic memories overlapping with her words. The blast threw me into a cellar stairwell. That's what saved me. The rubble collapsed over the top, burying me in the dark. Jordan touched the faint scar at the base of her throat, a ghost of a gesture. I was down there for 14 hours, bleeding, breathing in pulverized concrete and the smell of the 2 men I just killed. I died down there, Carter. He frowned, confused by the shift in her tone. You survived. No, Jordan said softly. Her eyes were completely void of light. The girl who enlisted at 18? The girl who believed in the flag? The girl who thought she was invincible? She died in that cellar. Staff Sergeant Thomas Hayes, the medic on the recovery team, officially called the time when they dug me out. He couldn't find a pulse. They zipped me into a black bag at the casualty collection point in Al-Hasaka. Carter's breath hitched. He stared at her, horrified. I woke up choking on my own coagulated blood halfway to Ramstein Air Base, Jordan said. A dark, humorless smile touched the corner of her mouth. My first breath in my second life tasted like aviation fuel and ozone. I terrified the flight nurse. Pushed my way out of a body bag with a shattered leg and a collapsed lung. I was reborn in the sky, Carter. Rebuilt with titanium rods, synthetic ligaments, and a whole lot of pharmaceutical-grade silence. The silence settled over them, heavier than the humidity in the bar. Carter looked at her as if she were a ghost, holding a physical form through sheer force of will. And in a way, she was. She was a walking contradiction, a dead woman buying tap water at a dive bar. Why are you here? Carter finally asked, his voice raw. Why aren't you on a beach somewhere? Why are you sitting in a dive bar in Virginia Beach letting guys like me talk down to you? Because the quiet is too loud, Jordan said. She finally took a sip of the tepid water. And because I like to remind myself what the living look like. The jukebox clicked, transitioning to an upbeat, aggressive rock song. The jarring shift in tempo seemed to snap the spell that had settled over their corner of the bar. The surrounding noise crashed back in the clinking of heavy pint glasses, the raucous laughter from the pool tables, the sharp crack of cue balls. Carter ran a trembling hand over his face, dragging his palm down his jawline. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the puddle of Maker's Mark soaking into the dust. He had spent the last decade building a fortress of cynicism and arrogant superiority to protect himself from the things he had seen. In 10 minutes, the woman sitting next to him had dismantled it completely, not with violence, but with the sheer, crushing weight of her reality. Carter started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to find his footing in a dynamic that had completely inverted. I should buy you a drink. Anything you want. Top shelf. Jordan turned her head, looking at him. The offer was genuine. It was the highest form of currency in their world, a silent acknowledgement of respect, a blood pact formed over distilled spirits. But she saw the way he was looking at her now. The awe, the pity. I don't drink, Jordan said. Right. Of course, Carter mumbled, embarrassed. He gestured vaguely to the bartender. Food? Then? A steak? Whatever they got in the back. Carter. Her voice was soft, but it carried a sharp, undeniable command. It was the voice of a team leader, the voice that cuts through the chaos of a firefight. He stopped moving. He looked at her, his eyes wide, waiting for orders. Stop, Jordan said. I want to pay my respects, he said, his voice dropping low, defensive and hurt. You gave everything. Your chalk. Jordan felt a sharp spike of irritation flare in her chest, hot and bitter. This was exactly why she stayed in the shadows. This was why her records were redacted, why she let the military bury her identity under layers of bureaucratic black ink. She didn't want to be a legend. Legends were carved in marble. Legends were dead. I'm not a monument, Carter, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "Don't look at me like I'm something holy. I'm just a mechanic who fixed a problem, and the machine broke me in the process. There is no glory in bleeding out in a cellar. There's just dirt and pain and the smell of your own shit." Carter flinched. The blunt, sensory brutality of the words stripped away the romanticized myth he had been clinging to. "You want to pay your respects?" Jordan asked, leaning in close enough that he could smell the faint scent of sterile laundry detergent and old canvas clinging to her jacket. "Go home. Get some sleep. Stop coming to bars looking for ghosts to validate your own misery. You survived. Figure out how to live with it." She didn't wait for his response. Jordan pushed herself off the stool. The movement was deliberate, calculated to mask the sharp, sudden spike of agony that shot up her spine from her L4 vertebra. Her left leg, the one held together by an intricately engineered lattice of titanium screws and a steel rod, stiffened, resisting the change in posture. She forced it to bear her weight, her face a mask of absolute terrifying neutrality. She zipped her bulky green canvas jacket, adjusting the collar to ensure the jagged scar at her throat was hidden from view. She pulled the brim of her dark baseball cap down, casting a heavy shadow over her eyes. In an instant, the apex predator vanished, replaced by a nondescript, slightly bulky woman heading for the exit. Carter stayed glued to his stool. He didn't turn to watch her go. He just stared at the empty space she had occupied, his hands resting flat on the mahogany surface, his knuckles white. Jordan navigated the sticky black linoleum floor, her movements fluid and utterly silent despite her heavy boots. She slipped past the loud group of young operators at the pool table, a ghost moving unnoticed through a crowd of men who thought they were the deadliest things on earth. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, stepping out of the humid, suffocating atmosphere of the anchor and into the cool, damp night of Virginia Beach. It had started to rain. A fine, misty drizzle that coated the street lamps in halos of fragmented light and made the asphalt slick and reflective. The air smelled of salt, ozone, and wet pavement. It was a clean smell, a living smell. Jordan stood under the awning for a moment, letting the cold air bite at her cheeks. She closed her eyes. She could still feel the phantom weight of the MK, 18 inches her hands. She could still hear the agonizing, rhythmic thud of the helicopter rotors fading into the distance, abandoning her to the dark. The ghosts were always there, clinging to her shoulders, whispering in the quiet moments. She was Chalk, the shadow in the dust, the woman who died in Raqqa. But as she stepped out from under the awning and into the rain, feeling the cold, wet droplets hit her face, she took a deep, steadying breath. Her leg ached with every step, her back burned. The physical pain was a constant, grueling companion. She smiled, a small, grim, imperfect expression that nobody saw in the dark. Pain meant she wasn't in the black bag anymore. Pain meant the nervous system was firing. Pain meant she was breathing. Jordan shoved her hands deep into the pockets of her jacket, lowered her head against the drizzle, and limped into the night, leaving the myth behind in the neon glow of the dive bar. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, she was just walking forward, alive.